My name is Emily Carter, and I am 28 years old. As I drove toward my childhood home in Ohio, I could feel the weight of the steering wheel under my hands, my palms clammy with anxiety. 5 years had passed since I left, and yet it felt as though nothing had changed. I was returning with a secret hidden in my bag, one that had the potential to shift everything in my family's eyes. I could almost hear my mother's dismissive tone from years ago echoing in my mind. She always thought my career choice was nothing more than a temporary distraction, a mere detour from the path I was supposed to walk. When I joined the military, choosing service over a corporate career, my parents had been disappointed. They always told me I could do better, that I was meant for something more prestigious, something that would set me up for success like the career my brother Adam had carved out for himself in the corporate world. He was the one they had always expected to succeed, the golden child, while I became a distant second in their eyes. But what they didn't know was that my path was leading somewhere far greater than they could have imagined. Tomorrow I would attend my father's company event, Pinnacle Cyber Tech, and my family would finally learn what I had achieved. They would learn that despite their doubts, I had succeeded beyond their wildest expectations. As the familiar surroundings of my hometown came into view, I couldn't help but feel the tension settle in my chest. This was not the homecoming I had envisioned. For years, I had worked tirelessly to prove myself, to climb the ranks of the military, yet it felt like my family still saw me as the daughter who had chosen the wrong path. But I was about to change all of that. I parked the car in the driveway and took a deep breath, trying to calm the unease that had settled in my stomach. The house in front of me looked the same as it always had. The faded white paint, the neatly trimmed lawn, and the same worn porch swing where I had spent countless hours as a child, all remained unchanged. It was as if no time had passed at all, and yet everything felt different. I had changed, and tomorrow I would prove that to my family. I stepped out of the car, feeling the cool evening air against my skin. As I walked up the front steps, I couldn't shake the familiar feeling of being judged, of not measuring up. Despite everything I had achieved, I knew that my mother and father still saw me as the daughter who had wasted her potential. My heart tightened as I reached for the doorknob and stepped inside. The smell of roast chicken and freshly baked bread filled the air, a comfort I hadn't realized I missed. But even the warmth of the home couldn't erase the tension that hung in the air. As soon as I walked through the front door, I was hit with the familiar sight of my mother, Laura, standing in the kitchen, her back to me as she prepared dinner. She didn't turn to greet me, as if her attention was too consumed by the meal she was preparing. It wasn't exactly a cold welcome, but it wasn't warm either. It was the same indifference I had felt for years. "Emily, you made it," she said, her voice carrying a hint of the same subtle disappointment it always had when addressing me instead of my brother Adam. I set my bag down on the hallway table and took a moment to soak in the familiar surroundings of the house. The faded family photos still lined the hallway, reminding me of a time when my achievements had mattered. There were no new pictures, no signs of anything changing in my parents' eyes. I was still the same daughter who had chosen a different path, one they had never truly understood. My father, Richard, was in his usual spot in the living room, his attention on his phone as he scrolled through emails. I could tell he was lost in the work that consumed him. It always had. His career at Pinnacle Cyber Tech had defined our family, and in turn it had defined the expectations he had for me. My brother Adam had been groomed to follow in his footsteps, and he had. They had always assumed I would join the corporate world too. But when I made the decision to serve my country, I had become an outsider in their eyes. Adam should be here soon, my mother said as I stepped into the kitchen. He just got another promotion. Senior project manager now. Can you believe that? The pride in her voice was unmistakable, the same pride she had always had when talking about Adam's successes. It was the same pride she had never once shown when discussing my career. That's great, I replied, trying to keep the bitterness out of my voice. It had become second nature to mask my feelings in this house. I didn't need to ask about Adam's accomplishments. I had already heard it all: the promotions, the high salary, the corporate perks. My brother was the golden child, the one who followed the corporate ladder that my father had always envisioned. He was everything my parents had wanted for me and more. As my mother continued talking about Adam's recent achievements, I excused myself and made my way upstairs to my childhood bedroom. The familiar surroundings felt both comforting and suffocating. The room was frozen in time like a museum of my past. High school cheerleading trophies, academic awards, and old college acceptance letters decorated the shelves, a reminder of the person I had once been. But there was no sign of the person I had become, the woman who had earned the rank of colonel in the military, a title my family had never acknowledged. I opened the closet door and stared at the clothes hanging inside my heart, heavy with the knowledge that my accomplishments had never been celebrated here. No photos of my military career, no congratulatory cards, no recognition of my achievements. My father had never attended my commissioning ceremony, and my mother hadn't even bothered to come when I earned my first promotion. My military career had always been a disappointment to them, a waste of potential. But tomorrow would be different. As I sat down on my childhood bed, my fingers traced the familiar quilt, the same one I'd slept under for years before I left. The memories came rushing back. I remembered how my parents had reacted when I first told them about the ROTC scholarship. Their faces had fallen, disappointment etched into every wrinkle. My father, Richard, had stared at me with a look I'd never forget, one that nearly made me second-guess my decision to choose a different path. I had been so close to changing my mind, to following the corporate route they had envisioned for me. The military is for people who have no other options, Emily. My father had said that night, his voice heavy with disapproval. You are smarter than that. That statement had stung more than I let on, but I stood my ground. I had believed in my choice, even though they didn't. I had wanted something more meaningful than a desk job, more than just climbing a corporate ladder that I felt wasn't meant for me. But to them, it wasn't real work. It wasn't successful. And then there was Adam. My younger brother had never been interested in the military. From the moment I made my choice, he had eagerly embraced the path our parents had laid out for him. Corporate success was his dream, and our parents, especially our father, had never let him forget how much potential he had. Adam thrived under their expectations, always reminding me of how much more successful he would be than I ever could. While he worked tirelessly to climb the corporate ladder, I had been making my own path, one they had never cared to understand. My mind wandered back to the night I had told my parents I was joining the military. It had been a Sunday dinner, the usual family gathering, when I had dropped the news. My mother, Laura, had been busy talking about Adam's latest achievements when I interrupted her. I'm joining the ROTC, I had said, the words feeling foreign as they left my mouth. The room had fallen silent. My mother had stared at me with an expression of confusion and mild horror, while my father had remained silent for what felt like an eternity. The disappointment in his eyes had been palpable. It had been enough to make me question myself. Maybe I was making a mistake. Maybe I was wasting my potential like they said. But deep down, I knew it was the right decision for me. Still, I couldn't help but wish they had been proud. Instead, they had buried their feelings behind condescension and indifference. As time passed, I kept my achievements to myself, knowing they would never understand. No congratulations, no kind words, just silence and judgment. Even when I had been promoted to second lieutenant, they hadn't shown up to the ceremony. Adam had been there, of course, sitting in the front row with my parents, their pride evident in every glance they shared. My promotion had barely registered in their minds. Now, as I prepared for tomorrow's company event, I had already decided I wouldn't bring up my military career during dinner. I had been careful to avoid any mention of it, knowing it would only be met with their usual dismissiveness. So I kept my uniform tucked away in the back of the closet, hidden behind old clothes from my childhood. I wanted to avoid any confrontation tonight. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow they would see me for who I had become. Not the daughter they dismissed, not the disappointment they had labeled me as, but a highly respected colonel in the military. A colonel who would be overseeing the very project that their company was working on. It would be a hard pill to swallow, but they would have no choice but to face the truth. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. Adam had arrived. I could already hear him and his wife Megan talking downstairs. Megan's voice was the same high-pitched tone I'd heard 1,000 times over the years. She was another example of what my parents valued. Another person who had followed the corporate path, married well, and climbed the ladder of success without ever stepping outside the lines. I stood up, smoothed out my clothes, and took a deep breath. I was ready to face them. I was ready to show them that my career wasn't a mistake, that my path had value regardless of what they thought. The dinner table felt smaller than I remembered. The air was thick with tension, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Adam had arrived with Megan, both of them dressed in their usual business casual attire that screamed corporate success, tailored suits, expensive shoes, the kind of look that my parents admired. Megan was the picture of polished professionalism, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her smile bright and confident. The same image my parents had always wanted me to emulate. My mother, Laura, was bustling in the kitchen, serving dishes, talking about Adam's promotion as if it were the greatest achievement in the world. "Your brother has been doing so well," she said, her voice warm with pride. "Senior project manager now, isn't that amazing?" I nodded, giving a half smile. "That's great, Mom." I said my words feeling hollow. I had heard it all before. Adam had been the golden child for years, constantly showered with praise while I was left in the background, my accomplishments brushed aside. The conversation turned to their new house in the suburbs, a spacious home that seemed to be a symbol of their success. A success that my parents had always expected from me, but I had never delivered. Every word my mother said about Adam's life felt like another weight on my chest. I excused myself from the table and retreated upstairs, needing a moment to breathe. When I stepped into my old bedroom, I noticed how much it had stayed the same. It was as though nothing had changed in the 5 years I'd been away. The cheerleading trophies from high school still sat on the shelf, the college acceptance letters, the framed photos of our family vacations. But there was no recognition of what I had accomplished since then. My military career wasn't there. My promotion to second lieutenant, my rise through the ranks, none of it had earned a place on these walls. My parents had kept the past preserved, but the person I had become was invisible to them. I took a deep breath and tried to calm my nerves. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow they would see who I truly was, not the daughter they had been ashamed of, not the one they thought had thrown away her potential, but someone who had earned her place in a way they would finally understand. But for tonight, I would have to face one more family dinner, filled with empty praise and polite indifference. I returned downstairs, my footsteps slow and deliberate, preparing myself for the inevitable. The dining room was just as I remembered, small, intimate, and crowded with voices that always seemed to drown out my own. My father, Richard, was sitting at the head of the table, occasionally checking his phone for work emails, a habit I had long since grown used to. "So, Emily," my mother began, turning to me as I sat down. "How is work going? You're still in the same position, right?" The way she asked it with that casual tone made it clear she had no real interest in the answer. It wasn't a question about my career, it was just another way to dismiss me. My father barely looked up from his phone, his attention consumed by his work as usual. "It's going well," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Still a captain or whatever it is?" my father asked, not even bothering to get the rank right. His disinterest was almost painful. I bit my lip, trying not to show the frustration building inside me. "Something like that," I answered, pushing food around my plate to avoid elaborating. The conversation soon shifted back to Adam. My mother couldn't help herself. "Tiffany just closed a multi-million-dollar deal for her bank," she said, her voice practically glowing with pride. "She's doing so well. She's everything you could have been, Emily, if you had just followed a more conventional path." Tiffany had always been the family's comparison point, the finance director who had worked her way up the corporate ladder without ever stepping outside the lines. The one who had followed the traditional route, the one my parents had always hoped I would be. "That's great for her," I said, forcing a smile. But it wasn't great for me. It wasn't what I wanted. I wanted my family to see me, to acknowledge my accomplishments, not measure them against someone else's. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of small talk with Gregory or Adam, as I still thought of him in my mind talking about his latest corporate project, my mother praising his success, and my father ignoring the conversation, still focused on his work emails. No one asked about my military career. No one asked about the long hours I had spent away from home, the dangerous missions, the training, the sacrifices I had made to get to where I was. My accomplishments were invisible, dismissed as irrelevant, as if they didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. As the meal drew to a close, my father mentioned again how important tomorrow's meeting was for his career. 28 years I've put into Pinnacle," he said with pride. "This contract could finally get me to vice president. I've worked so hard for this." I nodded sympathetically. "That sounds great, Dad." I said, my mind already racing ahead to the next day. Tomorrow would change everything. But for now, I remained silent, pushing food around my plate. Later that night, I retreated to my childhood bedroom once more. From down the hall, I could hear my parents still praising Adam's achievements. "He really is exceptional," my mother said. "Shannon Murphy will be foolish not to see his potential for senior leadership." I closed my eyes, my fingers tracing the colonel insignia I had slipped from my bag earlier. Tomorrow they would finally see who I had become. Tomorrow, everything would change. The next morning came too quickly. I woke up early, my mind already racing through the details of the day ahead. I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my uniform, ensuring that every medal and ribbon was in place. I could feel the weight of the Silver Eagle insignia against my chest, a reminder of everything I had accomplished in my military career, everything my family had refused to acknowledge. It was time to show them, to let them see who I had become and what I had earned through years of hard work and sacrifice. I had chosen this moment carefully. My father's company event was the perfect opportunity to reveal my true role in the project they had all been talking about for months. Pinnacle Cyber Tech's $1.3 billion defense contract was one that had been on everyone's radar. But what my family didn't know was that I was overseeing the entire project. I had been the military liaison for the contract for months, ensuring all security protocols were up to the highest standards and making critical decisions that would affect the future of the project. I left my childhood home early, knowing that my parents and Adam would be leaving shortly for the event. They had no idea I would be joining them, let alone in the capacity that I would. I drove to Pinnacle Cyber Tech's headquarters, my mind focused on the task at hand. I wasn't doing this to prove them wrong. I was doing it to prove to myself that I had earned my place regardless of their opinions. The building loomed in front of me as I pulled into the reserved parking spot marked Military Liaison. The sleek glass structure was a far cry from the small town I had grown up in, a symbol of corporate power and success. As I stepped out of the car, I straightened my uniform one last time. My heart raced, but I wasn't nervous. I was determined. Today, I would be seen for who I really was. When I entered the lobby, two security officers immediately recognized my rank and greeted me with professional respect. "Good morning, Colonel," one of them said, his eyes widening slightly as he processed my identification. "You're expected in the main conference room. Would you like an escort?" "No, thank you," I replied, keeping my voice calm and steady. I knew the building well, having studied the layout before arriving. As I walked through the security checkpoint, I felt the eyes of the employees around me shift. Military officers of my rank didn't visit regional offices often, especially not someone as young as me. I could feel the weight of their curiosity, the silent acknowledgement that something had shifted. The elevator took me to the executive floor where the day's meetings would take place. As the doors opened, I found myself face to face with Adam, who was reviewing some notes on a tablet. His eyes flicked up casually at first, then widened in shock as he saw the colonel insignia on my uniform. "Emily," he asked, his voice laced with confusion and surprise. "What are you doing here, and why are you wearing that?" I stood tall, meeting his gaze with a calm professionalism that I knew would disorient him. "Good morning, Adam," I said, my voice even. "I'm here for the project review." Before he could respond, my father Richard appeared around the corner, engaged in conversation with a couple of other executives. When he saw me, he stopped mid-sentence, his face going through a rapid sequence of emotions. First surprise, then confusion, and finally concern. He took a couple of steps toward me. "Natalie," he began, but quickly corrected himself. "Emily, what's going on? Why are you in uniform?" His eyes darted around nervously, as if unsure how to handle the situation in front of his colleagues. I stood there, my posture professional, my gaze unwavering. "I'm here for the project review. The meeting starts in 20 minutes. I answered, my tone calm but firm. The executives who had been speaking with my father were staring at me now, their eyes scanning my uniform with increasing recognition. One of them, Barbara Jenkins from the legal department, stepped forward, her face a mix of curiosity and respect. "Colonel, it's an honor to have you here," she said, her voice warm but respectful. "We weren't aware you would be attending in person today." I nodded, my gaze still steady. "I thought it would be more productive to be here in person today," I said before turning toward the conference room. "Excuse me." As I walked past them, I could hear the soft murmur of conversation starting to bubble up. The executives were clearly taken aback by the revelation. This wasn't how they had expected today to go, but for me, it was a long-awaited moment of truth. I entered the conference room where staff members were setting up materials for the meeting. A young woman behind the table almost dropped a water pitcher when she saw me enter. "Oh, Colonel, we weren't told you'd be here in person," she stammered. "It's fine," I replied, taking a seat at the position reserved for the military liaison. "Everything looks good. Thank you." I settled into my seat, reviewing my notes one final time. Soon other executives and team leaders filed into the room, most of them introducing themselves to me with a degree of respect I hadn't been shown at the dinner the night before. They had expected to meet the military liaison in a video conference, not face-to-face with someone of my rank and authority. I could feel my father and Adam's eyes on me from across the room, their disbelief palpable. Adam's usual confidence had faltered, and my father looked like he was still processing what was happening. But I didn't care. They had their chance to see who I was. Now it was time for the meeting to begin. The conference room was already buzzing with activity as the team leaders filtered in. I watched them carefully, noting their reactions as they registered my presence. As the meeting began, their introductions shifted from polite business formalities to genuine curiosity. The atmosphere was different now, charged with a sense of respect I had never seen in my family. It felt surreal, almost too good to be true. At first, no one commented on my sudden appearance, but it was clear that my presence had disrupted the usual flow. The silence in the room grew louder as the executives noticed me more closely, their attention focused on the silver eagle insignia on my uniform. I could feel the tension building. They didn't know the half of it yet. My father and Adam entered together, both of them looking uneasy. Adam's usual bravado had evaporated the moment he saw me. The confidence that had once defined him now seemed fragile. My father, too, wore an expression of confusion, his eyes darting around the room before they landed on me. He paused in the doorway, his face pale as the realization settled in. His daughter, the one he had dismissed for years, was not only here but was a senior military officer overseeing a project that could shape the future of their company. I smiled inwardly. It was hard to suppress the feeling of vindication, but I held my ground. The room had fallen into a state of stunned silence, and I could see the shock slowly turning into curiosity as my colleagues began to process the situation. "Good morning, Colonel Shannon Murphy." The CEO greeted me warmly, breaking the tension in the room. Her words were carefully chosen, her respect evident. "I'm glad to see you here in person today. I thought we were scheduled for a video conference." I stood up and shook her hand firmly. "I was in town visiting family," I said, keeping my tone professional. "I thought it would be more productive to be here in person to review the project." Shannon nodded, her gaze lingering on my uniform. Excellent initiative. Your presence will definitely make today's discussions more productive, she said, her voice carrying authority. For those of you who may not be aware, she continued, turning to the room. Colonel Williams is our Pentagon liaison for Project Aegis. She will be overseeing the implementation of the new security protocols and has final approval authority for all technical specifications. The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't out of confusion. It was out of respect. I could see the executives glancing at each other, their expressions a mix of awe and surprise. They hadn't expected to meet the person in charge of the military aspects of the project, especially not someone so young and so accomplished. As Shannon continued with the meeting, it was clear that the power dynamics in the room had shifted. Every presentation now had to address me, the person with the final say on the technical aspects. I noticed how the team leaders altered their presentations, adapting to the weight of my presence. They were no longer speaking to just Shannon. They were speaking to me too. When the first technical question about the project's integration came up, all eyes turned to me. I didn't hesitate. I knew exactly what to say, offering a detailed analysis that answered the question succinctly, drawing on years of experience in cybersecurity. My father and Adam exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. But it was clear that their world was shifting. The confident corporate world they had built their lives around was now crumbling at the edges as they realized just how much influence I had over the very project they were both involved in. The meeting progressed, and I could feel the room's attention shifting completely. No one doubted my authority anymore. I had earned my place here, and my expertise spoke for itself. My father had spent years dismissing my choices, telling me I would never amount to anything in the military. But now he was seeing firsthand how wrong he had been. Finally, it came time for Adam to present his portion of the project. As always, he had been confident, ready to share his ideas and strategies. But this time, when he caught my eye, his composure faltered. His usual arrogance slipped away, and for the first time I saw uncertainty. He started speaking, his voice wobbly, as though he wasn't quite sure of himself anymore. I could see the cracks forming. This was no longer a room where he was in control, where his every word was met with admiration. The reality of the situation had set in. He was no longer the star of the show. I waited until he finished before speaking up. "That's an interesting approach, Adam," I said, keeping my voice professional. "But I think we should take a closer look at the integration plan. There are some technical details here that need further refinement before we proceed." Adam froze, his face turning red as I asked pointed questions that exposed gaps in his plan. It wasn't out of malice. It was simply the nature of the project. I had a job to do, and I wasn't going to let anyone, even my brother, escape scrutiny just because we were family. The silence that followed was thick with tension, but I didn't back down. The project mattered more than family pride. As the room processed my comments, my father's face darkened, and I could see the dawning realization in his eyes. His daughter, the one he had never taken seriously, was now in charge of a project that had the potential to make or break their company. The meeting continued, and by the time it ended, the dynamics in the room had irrevocably shifted. Everyone now knew my authority. My expertise was unquestioned, and my rank was no longer something to be ignored. As the room began to clear, Shannon approached me again. "Colonel, I must say your reputation is well deserved. General Grant speaks highly of you, but seeing you in action today confirms everything I have heard about you." I nodded, feeling a small sense of pride welling up inside me. But before I could respond, I noticed my father standing off to the side, looking at me with a mixture of confusion, regret, and something else I couldn't quite place. He was waiting for the right moment to approach. But for now, I remained silent, letting the weight of my accomplishments speak for themselves. After the meeting ended, the room gradually emptied, and I stayed behind to gather my notes. The weight of the day's events hadn't quite sunk in yet. Everything had unfolded in a way I couldn't have predicted, but it felt like the start of something important, not just professionally but personally. The truth was finally out there. My family had seen what I had become, even if they hadn't fully processed it yet. As the last few executives left the room, I remained seated, staring at the presentation screen that was still displaying the project's overview. My mind replayed the conversations, the questioning glances from my father and Adam, the discomfort they had shown as the realization of my authority dawned on them. I was jolted from my thoughts when I saw my father approach the conference room door, hesitating for a moment before stepping inside. His posture was stiff, his expression unreadable. Adam stood awkwardly behind him, avoiding my gaze. "Well, Emily," my father began, his voice tentative, "that was certainly unexpected." I remained silent, allowing him to find his words. There was a long pause before he continued, his voice carrying a mix of confusion and reluctant respect. I didn't know you had risen so high. We didn't realize what you were really doing, not really." His words hung in the air, and I could see the struggle in his eyes. This was a side of my father I had never seen before. A side that, for once, didn't view me as a disappointment, but as someone who had achieved something meaningful. "It's been hard to know what to say to you," he added, his voice faltering slightly. "All these years we've treated you as if you hadn't made something of yourself, as if you hadn't succeeded. I was wrong. We were all wrong. I didn't know what to say at first. For so long I had yearned to hear these words from my father. I had longed for him to see me for who I truly was, to understand that my path had meaning, even if it was different from what he had imagined for me. But now that it was here, I didn't know how to process it. There was a bitterness that lingered, but also a strange sense of peace. "I don't need an apology, Dad," I said, finally, my voice steady. "I just needed you to see me, to see what I've done and understand that my career isn't a failure. I made my choices and I've succeeded on my terms." My father nodded slowly, as if he was finally absorbing the weight of what I was saying. He glanced over at Adam, who had remained silent through the entire exchange. I could see the shame in my brother's eyes. Adam stepped forward hesitantly, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. "I didn't know," he said quietly, his voice more subdued than I had ever heard it. "I didn't know how much you were really doing. I just thought, I thought you were still just pushing paper somewhere." I could hear the guilt in his voice, and for the first time I saw the real Adam, the person beneath the corporate armor he wore so well. "You never asked," I replied, my tone gentle but firm. "None of you did. You never took the time to understand what I was doing. You just assumed it wasn't important." "I didn't mean it like that," Adam said quickly, looking genuinely remorseful. "I guess I didn't see it, Emily. I didn't realize how much you had done. You're not just my little sister anymore. You're a colonel. You've earned that. I see that now." The words were harder for him to say than I expected. They were raw, unfiltered, and for once I didn't feel the need to hold back the resentment I had carried for so long. I nodded, accepting his apology even though it wasn't perfect. "You've always had the advantage," I said, turning to my father. "You and Mom always wanted me to follow your path." Adam took it. I didn't, but I'm not sorry for that. I've built something of my own. There was a long silence after my words hung in the air. I could feel the tension that had been building between us for years slowly starting to lift, replaced with something more difficult to name. Understanding, maybe. Or at the very least, an acknowledgement of the distance that had always existed between us. My father was the first to speak again, breaking the silence. "You were always capable of more than we gave you credit for, Emily. I've been blind to that. I'm sorry." For the first time in my life, my father used my name instead of my rank. It felt strange, but in that moment it was everything. I didn't need him to understand every detail of my career. I didn't need him to suddenly embrace everything I had done. But hearing him say those words, hearing him apologize, was enough to start the healing. I nodded, accepting his apology. "It's a start," I said, my voice quieter now. "But it's more than I ever thought I'd get from you." Adam looked at me one last time, his posture less defensive than it had been just moments ago. "I'm proud of you, Emily. I really am. I never knew what it took to do what you're doing, but I respect it." "Thanks, Adam," I replied, feeling the last of my walls start to crumble. "It's nice to hear you say that." My father cleared his throat awkwardly, the moment of rawness fading as he tried to return to some semblance of normalcy. "Well, I guess we're all due for a family dinner now, huh? Shannon wants to have us all join her tonight now that she knows we're, well, family." "I think I'd like that," I said, a small smile tugging at my lips. "It's been a long time coming." As we left the conference room, I glanced back at my father and brother. They were walking side by side, the tension between us still there but dissipating slowly, piece by piece. This wasn't the end of the journey. The wounds weren't completely healed, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like they were starting to understand me. And that was enough for now. The evening unfolded in a way I hadn't anticipated, but it felt like a new beginning. The tension that had gripped my family for so long began to ease as we sat down to dinner, the words that had been left unsaid for years finally being spoken. Shannon Murphy, the CEO of Pinnacle Cyber Tech, had invited us to dinner that evening to mark the occasion, knowing that my family was present for the project review. She had made it clear from the start that she was impressed with my work, and as we all sat around the table, her warm presence helped ease the lingering discomfort in the room. I could feel the change in the atmosphere as my father Adam and I shared small talk, the ice finally breaking after years of distance. Dinner was served in the company's private dining area, a spacious room with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. The modern, sleek decor stood in stark contrast to the warm, homely atmosphere I had grown up with. Yet as we settled into our seats, I could sense a shift in the air, a sense of unity that hadn't been present in so many years. My father Richard seemed different now. The walls he had built around himself, the walls that had kept him from truly seeing me, were coming down slowly. He sat up straight, Akira, his posture more open, his eyes no longer clouded with judgment. Even his handshakes had become firmer, more genuine, as if he was trying to make up for lost time. As we ate, I caught my father glancing over at me more often than I'd ever seen him do before. His expressions had changed no longer. Dismissive but thoughtful, as if he was taking the time to really see me for the first time in years. He had apologized earlier, and though it hadn't been the perfect apology, it had been enough to start the healing process. So my father began after a quiet lull in the conversation. I read the article about the cyber attack you helped prevent last year. I didn't fully understand all the technical details, but I could tell it was significant. My heart swelled just a little. It wasn't much, but it was something. For so long, my father had been dismissive of my work. For him to finally acknowledge the importance of what I had done was a small victory. It was, I replied, glad to finally share this part of my life with him. We caught it early, which was fortunate. If we hadn't, the consequences could have been catastrophic. My father nodded thoughtfully. I always thought military service was about physical combat, he said, almost as if he were talking to himself. I never really considered the cyber battlefield. I smiled a little. Most people don't, I said. That's part of the reason we can be so effective. Enemies don't always see us coming. There was a pause as my father processed my words. His expression softened as if he was beginning to truly understand the complexity of my work. You're right, he said, finally, his voice quieter. I never thought of it that way. We continued eating, and the conversation shifted to lighter topics, stories about work, memories from the past, and even some joking around. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like we were connecting. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. As the meal came to an end, the doorbell rang, signaling the arrival of General Eleanor Grant, my mentor and commanding officer. I'd invited her to dinner partly because she was in town for meetings, but also because I wanted my family to meet the woman who had believed in me when my own family hadn't. General, I greeted her warmly as she entered the room. Colonel, she replied with a smile, her presence as commanding as ever, even in an off-duty capacity. Thank you for the invitation. I gestured to the table where my family was seated. Everyone, this is General Eleanor Grant, my commanding officer and mentor. General, this is my family. My father stood immediately, extending his hand with a respect that I hadn't seen from him in years. General Grant, he said, his voice earnest. It's an honor to meet you. I understand you've played a large part in Emily's development. Eleanor shook his hand firmly, her smile genuine. The potential was always there, Mr. Carter, she said. I simply provided the opportunities for it to flourish. My mother, Laura, stood up as well, her smile slightly more hesitant but still sincere. It's a pleasure to meet you, General, she said, ushering Eleanor toward a seat at the table. Please make yourself comfortable. The dinner conversation continued to flow more easily after that. Eleanor shared some light-hearted stories from military life, which helped my parents better understand the world I inhabited. They laughed, asked questions, and even expressed some interest in my work, something they had never done before. Eleanor Ever, the tactful leader, was careful to keep her stories unclassified, but it was clear that my parents were starting to grasp the importance of what I did, even if they didn't fully understand it. I watched them interact with Eleanor, seeing them truly listen to her for the first time. My mother even asked Eleanor about her own career, her tone respectful and curious. There was a warmth in the room now that I had never expected to see. As dessert was served, my father cleared his throat and raised his glass. To Colonel Emily Carter, he said, his voice thick with emotion, "Who proved that following your own path can lead to extraordinary places? We may have been slow to see it, but we could not be prouder now." I raised my glass along with the others, my heart full. "Thank you, Dad," I said softly, the words meaning more than I had expected. That means more than you know. As the evening drew to a close, we all gathered in the living room for coffee and conversation. Adam, who had been noticeably quieter since the dinner began, came up to me. You know, he said, a hint of something resembling humility in his voice. I spent years thinking I was ahead of you in the game of life. Promotions, corporate success, making connections. But I see now you were playing an entirely different game, a much higher level. I was taken aback by his words, but I smiled, grateful for the honesty. It was never a competition, Adam, I replied. It never had to be. I know that now, he said quietly, the weight of his words carrying sincerity. And I'm sorry for making it one. I nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over me. Thank you, Adam. Later that evening, as I stood in the hallway watching my parents prepare to leave, I realized that this wasn't the end of the journey. The wounds weren't fully healed, but the walls had started to come down, and that for now was enough. As I closed the door behind them and turned back to the apartment, I thought about how far I had come. The validation I had once desperately sought from my family no longer defined me, but their recognition was still a step toward healing. 6 months later, I hosted my family for dinner at my new apartment in Washington, D.C. The spacious two-bedroom condo overlooking the city was a far cry from my childhood home, but it had become my sanctuary. The progress my family had made was undeniable, and though the healing wasn't complete, it was real. Tonight we had come together not just as family but as equals. It wasn't perfect, but it was a beginning.